Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to be doing session 11, using information to better understand fantasy stories. So, many fantasy writers use nonfiction to help them develop ideas for their novels. If you've ever heard of the Game of Thrones TV show, that was actually based on a book by George R.R. Martin. And so when he was researching, he did a lot of research, even though this was a fantasy story, before he started writing. And a lot of the things that he researched focused around the War of the Roses, the history that happened during that time period. And he added a lot of things, historical type things, into his books. You know, he made them more fantastical, but he used that as a basis for his books. Jane Yolen is another famous author that I know of she writes a lot of different types of fantasy stories. And just lots of different types of picture books and things too. She uses things like flowered guidebooks and geography texts when she goes to do her writing. So just as writers of fantasy refer to nonfiction texts to develop the worlds of their stories, readers of fantasy can refer to nonfiction texts to more fully understand the world they're reading about. So as readers of fantasy, you can use reference text and online factual information or other nonfiction text to build a full image of characters, settings, and events that you're reading about. So I've done this many times before. There might be something that I'm reading about, and it might be in a fantasy book or something, or just in a realistic fiction book or something I'm reading, and it'll refer to something in the real world, and then I'll go and actually look that up. Something that comes to mind quite a few years ago when I was reading a book called The Lost Symbol. The setting of the story was taking place in Washington, D.C., and they were going through all these different buildings in Washington, D.C. So I actually got onto a website to see, like, where exactly were these buildings at and what were they looking at. They also referenced a lot of different art in that book. Dante's Inferno, I had heard about it, but I'd never really looked at it. So I actually got online and I looked that up to see what exactly they were talking about as I was reading the story. I could refer back to that piece of art that they kept referring to, so I kind of had that visual in my mind. So when we look at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, some of you have read this book, some of you have seen this movie. This is a very popular fantasy book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's a really good one. Some things that you could possibly learn about in real life that this book triggers would be, you might want to learn more about lions, or there's beavers as a main character in that story, so you might want to learn more about beavers. In the very beginning, they talk about Turkish delight, which is a type of dessert. You might look that up to see what exactly is that. You might research more about England, because at the very beginning of the story, the children are actually set in England, and it's happening during World War II. So the first step is, what a topic, these are some things that I brainstormed that you might want to learn about. But then the next step would be, what topic do I want to focus in and learn more about? So the very first part is about the children who were living in England. They were sent to the English countryside due to the bomb threats during World War II. So I could research, why was that happening? Why were families sending their children to the countryside? That might be something I'd be interested in researching. But my favorite animal in the story is the beavers. And so I might research a little bit more about, why were the beavers? Why did the author really decide to put beavers in this story and make them an integral character? So I might do a little bit more research about beavers in England. So one of the websites I found that had this, I just researched beavers in England. And it was interesting to me to find out that beavers were native to the United Kingdom, to England, and they used to be widespread in England and Wales and in Scotland, but then they became extinct in the 16th century because of hunting for their fur, meat, and castoreum, a secretion used in perfumes, food, and medicine. And so that also reminds me of, when we talked about the French traders, and one of the reasons explorers were coming to England, or to the New World, was because of these furs that they were finding in the New World and then taking back to England. So because beavers were extinct at that time, so they didn't have them there. So anyway, I was able to find some information about beavers. And so The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was written over 60 years ago. So beavers would have been extinct in England at that time. So this makes me think that C.S. Lewis, the author of this book, knew this and put beavers into Narnia, as well as fauns and witches, to show that the children really did leave England when they went into Narnia, because none of these kinds of creatures were in the real world there. I also know that beavers are really industrious at building dams, and this fits with how they're portrayed in the book too. They're very hard workers in the book. So just thinking about these facts I learned from reading a short article about beavers, I'm thinking about these choices that C.S. Lewis made about including beavers as characters. But now I want to learn all I can about some of these other topics too. Like I might go back and do some research on lions or England, or like I said, about World War II during that time, or even Turkish delight. So readers, what I showed you guys today is by no means something that I would expect you to try to do every day, but I do think it's one of those things that would be fun and interesting to try occasionally, especially if there's a book you feel particularly interested in and you want to fully understand it. But it's also possible that even just a quick flip through a related nonfiction book or a quick internet search will do some interesting things for your reading. At the very least, you might picture things better, like I did with researching what that piece of art looked like. And at the most, you might be able to better understand the characters or the themes or the symbols or the ideas that are happening in the story. So if those types of things are piquing your interest as you're reading, don't forget to do that. I mean, take a minute and do some quick research on some of those things that you're curious about. So if you have some things that you are interested in, some things that are piquing your interest as you're reading in your fantasy books, take some notes here in your notebook and upload a picture of this for me today, like some of the things that you might be interested in researching based off of the topics you're reading about in your books. So, and if you have any questions, just please let me know. Make sure that you're really stopping to smell the roses. Remember, we talked about that. Don't just read through a book so quickly and not really think about what's happening in the story. Really take some time to think about what choices the author's making, why they're making those choices, what are some things you're thinking as you're reading. So happy reading, everybody.